Hello YouTube. My last video, one about afterlife, was not quite a success. And somebody on an internet forum told me that they think it is because not many people are interested in what I have to say about afterlife, as there is unlikely to be something original there, and that I should simply choose a different topic. So I have decided to make a new YouTube video, this time with a different topic, the topic of anarchism. I have already made a video about anarchism in Latin, back in 2019. This video will be comments to my earlier video. So how did I become an anarchist? Well, I realized that government backed up pseudoscience is pseudopsychology, suggesting my father was a rapist and that I was a witness, made both my parents lose their jobs, give all the money I was supposed to start my life with to lawyers, and made my mother and almost my father end up in jail. And the COVID-19 pandemic has made me more radical in both my vegetarianism and my anarchism. Before this pandemic, I knew about the problem of factory farming leading to superbacteria, but I thought it was not such a serious problem. I thought that if it does happen, there's plenty of what governments can and will do to contain the pandemic of superbacteria. Well, we have all seen how that works out, haven't we? In a pandemic, governments will issue a bunch of laws which people are not following, and God knows how effective they would be if people actually follow them. Take masks, for example. Almost nobody was wearing N95 masks or changing their medical masks every 15 minutes or so. People were mostly wearing dirty clothes masks, often below their noses. And the evidence that non-N95 masks would work if used properly is very thin. We can probably put it in the same category as the evidence that ketogenic diets help against epilepsy. I mean, it takes a huge study, such as the recent Bengali study, to find the effect that is just on the margin of error. The p-value of 5% is usually considered a margin of error. I don't know if it is reasonable to believe such things, that masks help against COVID-19 and that ketogenic diets help against epilepsy. I personally don't. What is certain is that they don't have a huge effect people tend to assume they are having. So governments are unlikely to help us with superbacteria. It's not to say there's nothing governments can do about it. Banning prophylactic use of antibiotics in animals would probably be a sensible policy. But governments that will do something as radical as that are unlikely to get elected. Anyway, let's start.
Salvete. Ego sum Theos amargia ex Croatia, et in hoc electronico visu, loquar quid censeam de philosophia politica. Qui multas res de philosophia politica sciunt, saepe etiam linguam latinam sciunt. Ergo et in hoc electronico visu loquar lingua latina.
So for those of you who don't know, that is Karl Marx. He did a PhD in atomistic philosophy, which is kind of amazing, right? I mean, he got famous for writing about things completely unrelated to his field of expertise.
Ergo ego anarchista sum, ego cogito melius esse si imperia et leges non essent. Ego non video, quomodo possint bonae leges existere. Quomodo possint leges imperiaque societatem protegere. Consideretis, nemo qui non insanus est vult aliquem occidere. Et politia paene semper venit solum modo postquam insanus homo occidat aliquem. Et tunc iudices paene semper sinit eum insanum hominem in carcerem. Carcer non est, et probabiliter non potest esse, locus ubi insanus homo sanus futurus est, carcer locus est, Ubi is plus insanus factus erit. Ergo, is insanus homo, qui suae insanitatis causa aliquem occidit, insanio revertetur in societatem.
Almost everybody is convinced there will be more violent crimes in an anarchy than there is now. If you ask them how, they essentially offer two different responses. Those who have thought less about it will tell you the police protects us from crime. To which I respond with, what do you mean the police protects us? The police almost always comes after a murder has already been committed. And then they put the insane person who murdered not to a place where he will rehabilitate, but to a place from which he will return with even more psychological problems that made him murder in the first place. It seems obvious they make things worse. The other and the more serious response is that prisons supposedly deter violent crime. Well, to paraphrase what Thomas Sowell said about Marxism, I think there's a simple test to tell whether prisons deter violent crime. If prisons deter violent crime, then countries with higher incarceration rate should be lower in violent crime. And the answer is clearly no. The countries with the highest incarceration rate in the world are North Korea and the United States of America, in each around 3% of the population being behind bars. Now it is hard to tell how common violent crime in North Korea is, since its media don't report about it at a heavy censorship. But the USA is the developed country that is by far the highest in violent crime. So the hypothesis of prisons deterring crime, while it perhaps sounds theoretically plausible, goes against the empirical data.
Sane, raris temporibus, politia venit antequam aliquis occidat aliquem. In aliquibus teris, et in Croatia, politia non permittat civibus tela habere.
Now, about gun control. Well, gun control makes a lot more sense than prisons do, as gun control at least tries to prevent crime, and it is not obvious how prisons try to prevent crime. However, a bitter truth is that guns sometimes save lives. Most mass shootings probably cannot be stopped by a good guy with a gun, but there are situations in which guns are used defensively. How often does this happen? Well, a study done by a criminologist called Gary Kleck in 1995 suggested that this happens around 2.5 million times each year in the US alone. Compare that to less than 50,000 times that guns kill people, including suicides. If that is true, and Gary Kleck's study suggests it might be, does gun control then sound like a good idea? Now, some of you might say that this number sounds implausible, and that it is likely that the vast majority of people surveyed in that studies are making the events more dramatic than they actually were. Well, actually, that doesn't seem like a plausible explanation, because in only 25% of cases in that study, the gun was actually fired. If people were making stuff up, wouldn't they say the gun was fired, rather than saying that just pointing the gun or even mentioning that they have a gun was enough? And even if that number is indeed wrong by orders of magnitude, gun control can still end up being counterproductive. Gun control laws mainly affect law-abiding citizens. They have little effect on criminals. Just like marijuana being illegal does not remove it from the streets, so won't gun control laws remove guns, which are easily manufactured illegally, from the hands of violent criminals. Also, a question I would ask people advocating gun control is, if owning a gun is a privilege to be earned, rather than an inalienable right, why do governments then deserve to have militaries? And having used marijuana is a proof you are too dangerous to own a gun. Then what if the massacre in 1995 is a proof that the Croatian government is too dangerous to have a military, isn't it?
et in aliquibus terris et in America iudices raris temporibus faciunt eum insanum hominem qui aliquem occidit occisum iri.
Now, about death penalty. Well, death penalty makes a lot more sense than prisons do because it, unlike prisons, actually prevents criminals from doing the crime again. Prisons are places from which criminals return, probably with even more psychological problems that they enter them within. However, I think it is still not a good idea. The death penalty is still not a good idea, and for the same reason, I think having antivirus software on your computer is not a good idea. Any real algorithm for detecting computer viruses, or for that sake, any other type of malware, is going to have at least some false positives. This is especially true today, and a lot of software, including internet browsers, have parts which produce machine code and executed that are just-in-time JavaScript compilers. Such pieces of software look similar to viruses. A lot of software today includes strong encryption, and they therefore look similar to ransomware. The point is, antivirus software probably makes us less safe because they sometimes make legitimate software stop working, which has just as bad effects as malware do. You can trust me on that because I'm a computer science student. Similarly, any real judiciary system that has death penalty will sometimes put innocent people to death. So death penalty probably makes us less safe. A vegan activist, Gary Orofsky, has another argument for death penalty, and that is that supposedly it is more humane to kill mothers than to force them to be in jail for life. That is the reason many vegans support death penalty. However, I don't think that's a good argument, because you cannot use one big government policy to justify the another. Prisons are one big government policy and they cannot be used to justify death penalty. That is another big government policy.
Sed evidentia harum rerum societatem protegendi non datur. Securitas quae nobis data a politia est falsa est. In saeculis historiae et si custodes et equites omnes spectabant et custodiebant non poteras vis in urbibus sciens securus alatronibus esse. Et de rebus oeconomicis linguae videntur esse sine imperis posse. Si linguae sine imperis possunt esse, cur oeconomia non possit. Leges saepe non permittunt divitibus hominibus tempus minimi salarii causa exampli gratia et res a pauperis hominibus emere, et eo dare pecunias pauperis. Eo modo leges saepe faciunt in aequalitatem maiorem esse. Et ego diligo quod Milton Friedman dixit. Maiora vectigalia et maiores taxationes paine semper significant. Minores pecuniae expensae caute et maiores pecuniae expensae non caute. Nemo est, neque politici sunt, ita cautus cum pecunis alterius quomodo is cum suis pecunis cautus sit.
I have heard yet another excellent quote that I think refutes the vast majority of government programs, one by the American vegan anarcho-capitalist philosopher Michael Huemer. He said that politicians are in the position of medieval physicians. They are trying to solve societal problems, but they are proposing cures based on their pre-scientific ideas of how society works, and just about every cure they propose turns either to have no effect or to be counterproductive. As somebody who has published a few papers in social sciences, I can safely tell you modern day social sciences have little or nothing to say about what governments should do. The same thing governments do is based on some pre-scientific ideas about how society works, rather than on rigorous social sciences. And just like medieval physicians with their bloodletting and similar cures, they are way more likely to hurt than to help.
Et de rebus bellorum. Paene omnia bella horum temporum pugnai sunt ut omnia bella cessent, sed bella nunquam bella inhibere succedent. Et tela solum modo raris temporibus veniunt ubi debentur. Arma bonorum hominum saepe veniunt in malas manus. Dum secundum bellum mundi durabat, America et Britannia dabant tela cetnicis, et cetnici secrete dabant ea tela fascistis. America et Britannia fecerunt secundum bellum mundi peius esse in Croatia.
Now about wars. As news flash about Croatia getting new military airplanes, I am thinking, what if another Hitler, a democratically elected tyrant, comes to power in Croatia and those weapons end up being used against us? Isn't that at least as likely to happen than that the military will protect us against a foreign invader?
Civitates amant falsam securitatem quod leges et imperia dant eis. Difficile pugnare contra ei est. Multi homines censent libertatem civitates oeconomice parum streunas facere, et quod libertas quodam modo facit homines res, quae non sunt rationales facere. Id est cur habebamus fascismum communismum et servos, sed possumus sperare numerum eorum hominum qui libertatem non amant minorem in futuro esse. Gratias vobis ad spectandum.
Just to clarify one more thing, I am not advocating a violent revolution. In a society in which almost everybody believes government is necessary, a violent revolution overthrowing the government will just lead to a more oppressive government forming. That's obviously not what anarchists want. Anyway, that's all for this video. I hope I made you think about politics.